let's briefly discuss where we've been. The United States created the global system in order to fight the Cold War. It was a bribe. We basically paid everyone to be on our side. We said that we would use our Navy to patrol the global oceans for everyone, so that anyone could go out at any time and interact with any foreign partner, get any commodity, sell any product, participate in any supply chain, and to be able to do it all without needing a military escort for everything that they did. That had never happened before. We know that is globalization. We know that is free trade. In exchange, they had to be on our side to face down the Soviets. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. And if the United States decides that it wants to continue this system, we need three things. First, we need a political culture that's bipartisan in nature, that is committed to globalization. Now, I personally would argue that that was long gone before January 6th. I'd say that was long gone before Trump. But right now, we don't even have a political culture. Rediscovering one will take time. It's going to be a big piece of this year and next year, but ultimately it's a 10-year transition. Now, let's assume for the moment that Biden is the guy. Personally, I don't. I mean, he couldn't even get his first bill through the Senate with a single Republican co-sponsor or vote, and 10 Republicans came to his office to ask how they could help. It's not a good sign. But let's assume for the moment that Biden's the guy. How long do you think it's going to take him to knit our cultural fabric back together? Come up with a plan to go out in the world and lead us there? A month? His whole term? More time than he has? You know, this isn't the sort of thing that is done overnight. This takes a decade. Until then, we're out. The second thing we would need is global interests. But the United States is the least involved economy in the world as a percent of GDP because the global system was a bribe. If we had actually invested in it and tried to make money off of it, it wouldn't have been a bribe. We would have just been another empire. It's not a popular sell. And then third, we would need a global military footprint in order to keep the peace, patrol the oceans, prevent interactions that could cause economic harm to the world. We have been slimming down the number of troops that we have abroad since the start of the Cold War. We're going to have fewer than 10,000 troops in the Middle East. Sorry, we have fewer than 10,000 troops in the entire Middle East now. We're going to be going down to 0 later this year. We haven't simply decided to leave. We've already left. Globalization is already over, and what's left is just running on inertia. So that's the strategic piece of this. And what is left is simply running on inertia. Let's talk about the numbers. Let's talk about the economics. This is a standard demographic profile. Children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. Mortality tends to build it into a pyramid. Now, this is Mexico. This is what we consider to be a consumption-led system, because whenever you have a lot of people aged roughly 40 and below, it's all about raising kids and going to college and buying homes and cars. That consumption is what drives modern systems. And when American policymakers look at a system like Mexico, we really like what we see. Two things. First, people who are under age 40 are new on the job. Their value add is somewhat limited. And as a result, Mexico excels at low and mid-skill manufacturing and assembly. That's not what the American worker does. We do the design, we do the high end. So the propensity for integration between those systems is huge. Second, Mexicans are young, which means they buy a lot of product, which means they buy a lot of American product. Mexico became our largest trading partner in calendar year 2019, and if not for the COVID hiccup, they would be still today. They'll take that role back this year, and they will never give it up the rest of our lives. This is a partner. This is not. The Koreans had a baby bust 50 years ago. They never recovered. So they've got a lot of workers in their 50s and early 60s, folks with literally decades of expertise, very high value added, going head to head with the American worker. But there are no young Koreans, so that product has to be sold abroad, primarily here. We will always have a trade deficit with the Koreans. From roughly 1980 to roughly 2015, the world was in a beautiful demographic moment. Here we've got a number of major economies in the year 2000. Everyone was either like Mexico today, consumption-led, or like Korea today, export-led. And the balance was perfect to maximize integration and trade. So we saw the greatest expansion in trade, wealth, and personal incomes in human history. And it lasted an entire generation. That generation is what we're used to. That's our entire professional lives. But 20 years later, we're all 20 years old. The consumption-led systems are aging into export-led, and the export-led are aging out and becoming what I call post-growth. Look at China in particular. They had a baby bust that doubled down last year, their lowest birth rate ever. And remember, it takes 9 months for a kid to get born, which means that most of that birth rate drop was because of decisions made in 2019 before COVID. China is now the fastest aging society on the planet, the fastest aging society in human history. And at most, there'll be 45% the population that they are today by the time we get to century's end. The global demographic of high consumption was already ending. It was already going to end the first half of this decade. Now, here in the United States, we're a partial exception, and it's largely because of what the baby boomers have done. Now, in some ways, the baby boomers are just like everybody else around the world. When their parents came home from the war, they started families. We had a baby boom. That's the boomers. And they're all aging at the same rate, and they're all retiring at the same time. And that changes the capital structure. So think of how you have invested in your life. When you're 35, you invest a very small sliver of a very small income for the future. When you're 55, you invest a very fat wedge of a much larger income. And when you're 64 3/4, every spare cent you have, you shove into your retirement savings. As you age, you invest a greater percentage and a greater volume. And then you retire and you stop. The velocity of money doesn't simply stop, it reverses because you have to liquidate your stocks and bonds and go into things like T-bills and cash. That cliff jump happens in calendar year 2022. We're only a year away from that. So we're experiencing the cheapest credit we've ever known, and very soon we're going to be experiencing the most expensive credit we've ever known. In that, the baby boomers are exactly the same. They were all born at the same time. But American baby boomers did one thing different from the rest of the world's boomer cadres. They had kids, they had the millennials. Now we can say whatever we want about the millennials, and there's so very much we can say about the millennials, but they've got one thing going for them that their cadres the world over don't. They exist. They're consuming today. Tomorrow they'll be investing. And that means the United States has a minimum of 20 more years to figure out what to do with the world of collapsing consumption than everybody else. Let me stack it up for you. Here are the world's consumption-led systems ranked by GDP, or stacked by GDP, as of the data we had from last year. Here's where they'll be in 10 years. It's a significant drop, about 15%. Here's the export-led systems. They vanish as a class. Today, we only have one post-growth economy, but very soon, we knew global consumption was going to peak in the first half of this decade. We knew that global capital supplies was going to peak next year, and we know that global production is peaking right now. None of them will recover in our lifetimes. And all that was before COVID. Now, all the consumption-led economies of the world are under some degree of lockdown and in some degree of recession, which means that it doesn't matter if you're export-led, you have no one to sell to.